As somebody who's going to talk about sustainability, I just wanted to perhaps drag your attention to first what we're doing at the University of Southampton. And this graphics here illustrates what we're doing. You can see we're doing quite a lot of activities around not only sustainability but also net zero, as well as behavior change. And we are about 50 academics and researchers looking at energy and climate change. And sustainable cities and how to pull cities into sustainability pathway is one of the drivers in our work here. And if you look at the initial definition of sustainability in the early 80s, basically it's built on 3 pillars: economy, environment, and society. And the message is really we should not muck up our current living environment. We should also leave something for our children and their children as well, to keep them living in a very habitable environment. So basically the message is, don't do it wrong, right? Not only for us, but for our children as well. So I'm going to take you through the new activities around sustainability. And this is the Sustainable Development Goals, where all the countries in the world signed up to in 2015. And you can see that there are 17 of these pillars or goals. And these goals are really dependent on each other. And each one of them has got also different criteria around how you assess them. And they are about holistic approach to the way we live. Not just about growth, but also about well-being, also about health, also about education, about leaving no one behind by 2030. So these targets need to be met across what we do here, in addition to net zero. But cities is one of the goals, okay? And cities cannot exist without energy, for example, without transportation, without water resources, without green spaces, and so forth. So they are interlinked. Cities are interlinked to all other sustainable development goals. And since we are talking these few weeks about COP26, it's not just about carbon, although carbon actually plays a major role into that. Okay? Air quality is dependent on how much carbon we put out in the atmosphere and so forth. So we need to think that it's not just about carbon, but also carbon is a really big player in our sustainability. So cities and their development is really quite interesting to look at those. When you think about their footprint, it's only about 2% of the land area is covered by cities, okay? The land area of 2% consumes about 75% of our energy, for example, and also provide about 75% of our emissions. So cities have got a really major role to play in our development. Significant role, I would say, because they have the leadership. They have the leadership not only to act locally, but nationally and also across the world. For example, Glasgow is actually today are acting right across the world, because what's happened in Glasgow affects everybody in the world. We also have cities that could have carbon targets, could have other targets related to our education, our health and so forth. And these will transition us into these development goals. Cities also have wealth. There is also growth in there. There's also innovation around cities. You've got SMEs who are producing innovations. You've got universities, colleges, and also producing innovations. And also, these cities have got a lot of infrastructure that could be adapted to allow it to show leadership. Bringing all that together, cities could really have a significant role into our development, not only about carbon, but everything else we do. And that's why it's important to have cities to be sustainable. And cities are very different. So this is an image from one of my PhD students where he studied Southampton in detail. You can see Southampton progressing from 1890 until now, and you can see it's growing, okay? In some instances without planning, it's just happened because we need to have to grow and so forth. But every city is very different. Birmingham will be different, Glasgow will be different, and I'm giving you an example of Southampton because this is where I live. And here is where Southampton now, okay? So city is surrounded by water, but it is disconnected city. You got the river disconnecting half of the city, and our connection in terms physical as well as, but our digital connection is not really very good in the city itself. We don't even have, for example, water transportation around the city, if you just think about it. But the city is very important, as Peter mentioned in his speech. I don't know where Peter's gone now. It's really extremely important, and that's why we need to make sure that actually it comes around a sustainable city in our approaches to what we do. Is it going to grow? Is it going to sprawl? Is it going to buy Eastleigh, for example? Anybody from Eastleigh here, right? Or is it going to buy a bit of Winchester because it's growing so fast? So the city has to think about its physical footprint. And you're here talking about buildings. Is it likely to go up in terms of what it needs to have? So buildings are very important in the space here around cities and the physical footprint of the city. Then we have this other issue around climate change, and Peter already alluded to that before. And climate change, we have the Climate Change Committee, which is under the 2008 Climate Change Act, which is a statutory independent committee that tells the government what they need to do in terms of achieving net zero. And here the carbon budget, the image here indicates to you the carbon budgets. And you can see all the thing under the blue and that before has been already negotiated and agreed. Carbon budget 6 is still under discussion, and this is really the one that is around to drive us around net zero. And this is important to understand that those budgets are based on solid evidence, what the government needs to do, what us in cities need to do. But understanding those budgets is related to climate change. And climate change provides both threats and opportunities. And I will talk to you about the threats first. So here is the city of Southampton as we are today. What happened when the temperature rises? So look at the blue ingression of the water coming in. So the temperature now going to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And you can see even at that temperature, Southampton is threatened. The docks, for example, and areas around the Itchen are really threatened by sea level rise if you don't do anything about it. Doing something about it is an opportunity. If the temperature is allowed to go to 2 degrees centigrade, you can see quite a lot of the city is underwater, right? And if you go to higher than that, 4 degrees centigrade, is actually even worse, which means that instead of playing football in St. Mary's, we'll probably have to swim in St. Mary's. So there you go. This is an enlarged image to say the differences between 1.5 degrees centigrade and 40, and that's why it's so important for cities to realize it. So it could be another city on the seaside that actually have got these impacts on it. And it's important to understand that if water is allowed to ingress in there, well, where will the people go from the city? What impact will have that? What impacts will that have on, let's say, Eastleigh and Winchester and so forth? So planning around that will be very important. So how do you plan for the future? What are the risks and what are the opportunities? How do you engage the citizens to understand that, right? But climate change also have other impacts on buildings, and I didn't have a graphic here to show you, right? One of it is rising temperature. So you'll have heat stresses in buildings. How do you allow for ventilations to happen? How you design for that? And all that sort of thing. It needs to, it needs to come into part of the exciting growth that we have here, that the buildings will be resilient for the next 100 years. So the pathway to net zero is already planned for us by the Climate Change Committee, and it's made up of different things that we need to do, and I just don't want to take a long time on this. And you can see these are all related. The first one is related to resource and energy efficiency. We need to reduce our consumption in our buildings, and we also want to provide resources within those buildings. And I hope I'll give you some indication of that as we go along. And the next one is, for example, by industry. We need to reduce our emissions from industry. Carbon-intensive industries need to reduce it. Intensive electrification. We're doing very well in the UK because we've got offshore wind, so we're actually investing in there. Have photovoltaics as well, solar energy, and also onshore wind. But for us, in terms of the building, it's about the heating. But if temperature is going to be rising, it's going to be about air conditioning. And we need to think locally about how to apply solutions for the heating that we have now, and also solutions for the air conditioning loads that are likely to happen in the future. Then it goes on about economy and hydrogen, for example. There's a huge assets around the Solent region which need to be decarbonized. Think about the power station, which is 800 megawatts down on in the Southampton water. Think about the incinerator. Think about the Foley refinery. Think about all the buses and garbage trucks that we need to have. Think about the airport that Peter mentioned. Could that be part of the solution around hydrogen? And there are discussions around whether the region could be part of the hydrogen story around for the UK. Okay, but what one needs really is data about cities. And this is our understanding, our work that was done for Southampton City Council. And this work is related to what's the status of our building block, our building stock in Southampton. This is the domestic buildings. That gives you an indication of the insulation, the window types, and so forth. And with the spider diagram on the left-hand side indicates to you where you are doing well, where you're doing poor, right? And you can see for floor insulation is really very poor, and we're not really anywhere closer to the good, for example, for hot water systems and for main heating systems, and also for heating controls, right? You can think about the insulation, as mentioned about the insulation here. That insulation as well needs to be up to scratch and actually fit for purpose as well. So that this map gives policymakers where drivers and investment should happen to allow us to achieve that net zero in terms of our refurbishment for the current building stock. In fact, any new buildings that need to be built should be zero carbon, right? This is my view. Okay. So you got this data, and I just talk about the data for the buildings itself, right? About the building fabric, about what happened in the building. But you can have also other data sets around transportation, for example. What's the sunlight that's coming in, solar radiation, economic analysis, where are people who are very poor and so forth. How you open up the spaces to allow integration between utilization and so forth. So this data is very important to allow a sustainable city to grow. So at the building level, be it a domestic house or a large building, one needs to think about what sort of energy requirement the building should have in terms of the fabric, in terms of the living spaces and so forth. And the things that one could do is looking at the ground for energy, looking at the air, or looking at solar or wind energy from those buildings. And this is really quite important to understand that at the design stage, especially if you're going to do new buildings. And if you're thinking about commercial buildings, I have this graphics here which we did some work on about photovoltaics, which is solar panels that you put on the roofs or integrated within the building facade, and you can have them a different aspect for the building. And this is published already, so if you wanted to have a copy of that, just look at our website and just download a copy of it. So the crux of the matter is around how we think from day one, from the inception of a project, how we can utilize energy systems around it to make it sustainable or make it zero, for example. And these are examples of buildings that we have in our university. So a possible thing about cities for the sustainability is you utilize all those roof spaces, all those areas that are not used for anything except to protect the building from the weather, to utilize it to produce energy, let's say producing electricity from solar panels. And that is possible and feasible, has been happening all around the world now. And then the other consideration one needs to have is looking at what else is around in the city. And for example, Southampton's got 3 major combined heat and power systems. One at the university, one in town, which is augmented by geothermal energy, one at the hospital. And there's already studies to see whether we can actually connect these CHP buildings, CHP systems together so they work collaboratively and increase the footprint of supplying of heat to buildings. Now, if we increase that footprint, we need to decarbonize that. So this is the role also coming out for hydrogen that we can think about. You can also go the incinerator, which is across Southampton Water, which produces quite a lot of heat, which is basically dissipated out in the atmosphere. So that heat could also be pumped into the CHP systems and actually utilized to heat our buildings. You can think about, as I mentioned earlier, energy efficiency, and I gave you the graphics around insulation and so forth, and also around windows. Energy efficiency could be linked to investment. So refurbishment options could provide the growth that you need to have, but you need to have the investment. You also need to have the labor force to actually do it. And then the last bit is buildings as generators. And I mentioned this already before, that buildings could be utilizing photovoltaic systems. And if I can't use the energy in my house, I'm away working or I'm here giving a lecture to you guys, but my neighbor is there at home, I could sell that to my neighbor at a higher price than selling it to the grid. So data becomes very important about this exchange of energy. So transitions to low carbon actually provide these opportunities that we could exploit, and data is at the heart of it. So connectivity through digital and physical aspect is really important. So the city itself could be developing not only around its infrastructure, but around cohorts, around its universities, and around its colleges and so forth. So the other aspect of resource efficiency is actually our behavior. So this is a group of housing that we've been monitoring since 2005. It's 15 years or 16 years now. And it's about the behavior. And I just illustrate this with a graphic here. The blue curve is the energy consumption. Basically, it's the electricity being utilized within the household. And the black curve, which is here, is what's produced by the solar panels on the roof of that building. And the red curve is what's being sent to the grid. Now, if you are importing at 19 pence a kilowatt hour, and you're sending it to the grid, and you'll get paid about 4 pence a kilowatt hour, it makes more sense for you to utilize that kilowatt hour that you produce in the house. So if you could shift your behavior to actually utilize, like your dishwasher or washing machine, at the time when the sun is shining, if there is much of the sun shining in the UK. So behavior change is very important. It's also important in relation to providing data from all those systems to allow us to see whether we can store that energy and utilize it in the evening when we don't have any sunshine, and also what market opportunity, for example, could be developed in terms of time of use tariff. Could we sell our electricity to our neighbors, for example, or sell it to the grid at a higher price? Okay, now I'm going to finish talking about these solutions, but I'll talk to you now about sustainability. And sustainability is really a journey. And this graphic illustrated. It's really about making a commitment in the first instance. Once you made that commitment, then you think about how you assess that commitment. Once you assess that commitment, then you look at the targets, the gaps that are in those commitments that you need to understand, and then you look at organization strategy. So you produce your strategy, how to be sustainable. Let's say you said you want to be net zero by 2030. That's the strategy you develop, and then you develop how you're going to go about it. And then you have a plan to implement this. Then so once you have that plan, then you have a yearly assessment of that. And you can see what else you can do further to achieve that 2030 target. And then you have a validation, ideally by somebody external to you, to indicate to you where you're scoring and so forth. And then you can update your strategy to build it up for the year after that. So it is a commitment and an assessment process, and then revisiting that assessment process. So that could be done at the in organizational level or at the city level. And at the city level, here what Southampton City Council did about 2 years ago, where they have the Green City Charter. So they have 5 pillars, and you can see it's related to resources, energy and carbon, delivering clean air, natural environment, resource management, and also sustainable transport. So when they announced this, and about 73 institutions within the city signed up to that Green City Charter, they asked us what could we do with this? So we developed a mathematical model which is robust to allow us to understand how you make the assessment, how you gauge it, how you score it, and how you give you information about how you be better in the year after that. So about 39 criteria that we got together, and those criteria were weighted by experts in the field, which have been surveyed, to allow us to give a rating for where you're at. And if you are interested, there is the website on the left-hand side. You can see it. So this is the rating for Southampton City Council. Anything that you can see in white, they're not doing very well. For example, 3 here, which is publishing the strategy, okay? And 4, low carbon heating. So it didn't have very much of low carbon heating, Southampton City Council, right? So that gives you a quick indication where your investment should be in the next year to come and so forth. And you can do that for transportation, for example. You can do it for waste management and so forth. So as an organization, we as a university also have our own targets. So we have 6 goals that are created and developed and agreed by all people in the university. And you can see the first 3 goals are related to our emissions. And we declared that we're going to be zero carbon by 2030. And there's a development plan that we're organizing, and there is a plan to tell us how we're going to achieve by 2025, 27, and by 2030. And the other 3 goals are related to our operation, where we need to have sustainability at the heart of our research, our education, and also our investment. So that could be assessed in the same fashion as you assess the city. And here's the outcome for the city. For 2020, you can see both Southampton and the University of Southampton, where I guess around 65 to 61. So just basically satisfactory. And we hope that in 2020, the council could be good. We haven't got 21 rather this year. Council could be good, and Southampton will be much better than it is now, right? And I know for sure, because we have implemented the policy in the university, that will be around that level for this year. So the tracker that we have developed is relevant to cities or institutions or associations or organizations, as long as they can provide the data that allow us to put that in. And now we're taking this tracker and we're working with the city of Winchester and also Portsmouth City to make the tracker applicable to their cities, as well as to the organization within those cities. So I'm going to summarize, and this is my last slide. So what if scalable sustainable interventions become the norm for clean development? And that also includes buildings. And if we build on the emission reductions that we had due to COVID-19 and actually speed up the transition to low carbon, reducing our dependence on fossil fuels, implementing activities around solar, wind, geothermal, and so forth. And if you look at buildings, and this is one of our campuses in the Highfield, you can see we have got quite a lot of buildings. We only got photovoltaics in about 4 buildings in our institution. Not that we haven't tried, we have been tried, but it's always been costed out because it's more expensive and so forth. So nevertheless, I think because of the targets that we need to have, commercial buildings should come at the forefront of showing the light to everybody else that we can actually produce buildings that are at zero carbon. Then we can look at schools and universities and other things. We can also think about storage. If you're going to produce electricity in the building itself, and it's really not utilized during the day, but you need it in the evening, we can think about adding storage. And this graphic here illustrates the peak in our demand between 4 o'clock and 9 o'clock in the evening. So if you have a 3-hour of storage, which you store all your photovoltaic energy into those batteries, you could utilize it without being impacting on the grid. So you reduce your dependence on the grid. And then electrification of transport is very important, and we're looking at ways, infrastructure for electric charging vehicles. How could that be done in cities? How could that be adapted? How you connect it up to what's available in terms of low voltage network. And I think what we need to have is a message to the government that they need to have the support mechanisms to allow us to reach the net zero, especially for implementing, let's say, photovoltaic systems, and also storage, and also infrastructure around electric vehicles. And the building sector could really be the spark for doing this revolution in terms of innovation. We've got a lot of companies, a lot of universities that could help out in that building sector. And I think data and intelligent cities are very important in the role, not only to allow us to live securely in our cities, but also to allow us to transition to a low carbon technology. And I think science and evidence-based research is really important to allow us to make sure that we get it right from the start. Okay, so I hope I can convince you that we should work together to make this all happen. And hopefully I have navigated something around sustainability for you today. And I couldn't have done it without my team. So this is our team celebrating our Christmas before COVID-19. Hopefully we'll have the same Christmas party this year. And thank you very much for listening.
Any questions to all? Sorry, go ahead in a second.
Hi, Steve Slocum, Southampton City Council. Agree with most of that. Southampton wants to become a world-class city which attracts loads of people to come and visit. On my tongue, not on my cheek. That's a major aspiration. To get people to come to the city, we need sustainable transport solutions, but people are going to come by car. We need the infrastructure for people to come. So, what's your view on that? The car versus train versus other modes of transport?
Well, I think Southampton is really well connected by train, and I would suggest that a train and also air is now becoming quite important. So I would suggest that people should perhaps think about coming by train. The train station is right in the middle of the city. There are also substations around that. But I think private vehicles will be very difficult to overcome if we don't have them transition to low carbon vehicles. And the way you do that is actually have incentive for them. You have the infrastructure for them to come around and say, I will be able to get some juice into my car if I go into Southampton. So what we did for Winchester City, we looked at where to position about 50 charging points for the city based on 10 minutes move from the house or from any point that you come in, let's say, to the station. And this is what Southampton needs to do, is to have a study to position charging points to allow people to come into the city with low carbon transportation. And I will agree that this is what needs to be done.
Thank you. Any more questions at all? No, thank you.
Thank you.